Good evening and welcome to This Week in Turkey. The international non-governmental organization, Transparency International, has released its Corruption Perception Index 2019.
The Corruption Perception Index 2019, released by Transparency International, a non-profit organization that aims to take action to combat global corruption with civil societal anti-corruption measures and prevent criminal activities arising from corruption, ranks 180 countries and territories by their perceived levels of public sector corruption, according to experts and business people. This year's analysis shows corruption is more pervasive in countries where big money can flow freely into electoral campaigns and where governments listen only to the voices of wealthy or well-connected individuals. The index uses a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is highly corrupt and 100 is very clean. More than two-thirds of countries score below 50 on this year's Corruption Perception Index, with an average score of just 43. Similar to previous years, the data shows that despite some progress, a majority of countries are still failing to tackle public sector corruption effectively. Turkey scored 39 points out of 100 and is ranked 91st among 180 countries. According to this result, Turkey lost 2 points compared to last year and has fallen back 13 places. Corruption index in Turkey averaged 39.38 points from 1995 until 2019, reaching an all-time high of 50 points in 2013 and a record low of 31 points in 2003. To end corruption and restore trust in politics, it is imperative to prevent opportunities for political corruption and to foster the integrity of political systems. Transparency International recommends the management of conflicts of interest, the control of political financing, strengthening electoral integrity, regulating lobbying activities, empowering citizens, tackling preferential treatment, and reinforcing checks and balances.
Turkey is joining the World Economic Forum in Davos this year with a more positive outlook, the Turkish Treasury, Finance Minister Berak Albayrak said on Wednesday.
Turkey sees 2020 as an important year for foreign direct investment, Albayrak said during the 50th World Economic Forum in the city of Davos in Switzerland. After an unsteady environment and currency attacks over the past 18 months, Turkey's circumstances have now taken a turn for the better, Albayrak highlighted. Underlining that growth was the World Economic Forum's main focus this year after environmental concerns, he stressed that while developed and developing countries' contributions to the world economy are decreasing, Turkey's 5% growth target for 2020 was important for the world. The Turkish House, a small modular building that looks like a cottage, has been set up at the World Economic Forum to showcase investment opportunities and local products from Turkey. It was launched under the guidance of the Treasury and Finance Ministry in coordination with the Banks Association of Turkey. Representatives from the Turkey Wealth Fund, the Turkish Investment Office, and the Turkish Finance Office were also scheduled to hold bilateral meetings with executives from investment companies, wealth fund managers from other countries, and portfolio managers.
A committee of trustees has been appointed to the Foundation for Sciences and Arts. Among the founders of the foundation was also former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who has recently established a new political party.
As reported by the conservative daily Karar, a committee of 3 trustees from the General Directorate for Foundations went to the Foundation for Sciences and Arts, also known as BİSAV, and informed the foundation that they were appointed as a trustee in their place. The executive committee of the BİSAV is expected to lodge an objection against the appointment of trustees. BİSAV Board of Regents founding chair Mustafa Özel has released a written statement where he denounced the decision. This arbitrary attitude is a grave step that could inflict great harm on our hundreds of years of foundation history, and it is also a dangerous action that could affect not only the Foundation for Sciences and Arts, but all foundations in our country as well, the statement read. A number of Turkish NGOs, civil society organizations, and legal associations have come out in criticism of the move. It is unacceptable to carry over the process of seizing the Şehir University to the foundation, read a statement released by Turkey's conservative Humanitarian Relief Foundation. Previously, the control of Istanbul Şehir University, owned by the Foundation for Sciences and Arts, was also seized. On December 19, 2019, the Council of Higher Education decided to temporarily hand over Istanbul Şehir University to Marmara University, the guarantor university. former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who launched his new party to rival the Justice and Development Party, is among the founding members of BİSAV. BİSAV is commended as a leading institution of Turkey's conservative intellectual circles.
Foreign powers agreed at a summit on Libya in Berlin on January 19 to enforce an arms embargo established by the UN Security Council and to work towards de-escalating the conflict that has gripped the nation since the fall of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in 2011.
The participants of the conference have reaffirmed their strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and national unity of Libya. They have emphasized that only a Libyan-led and Libyan-owned political process can end the conflict and bring lasting peace. The leaders have agreed that there can be no military solution in Libya and expressed the joint commitment to refraining from interference in the armed conflict or in the internal affairs of Libya and urge all international actors to do the same. A special committee made up of 5 military officials from each side will monitor the truce, German Chancellor Merkel said. Foreign powers active in Libya have committed themselves to uphold an existing UN arms embargo and stop shipping weapons there, she added. Fayez al-Sarraj and Khalifa Haftar, despite both being in Berlin, not only did not meet, but they were not in the conference hall while the fate of their country was discussed among world leaders. Haftar, whose Libyan National Army is bearing down on the capital Tripoli with the backing of Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Russian mercenaries, and African troops, had abandoned talks over a ceasefire last week in Moscow. Turkey's parliament on January 2 backed a motion on sending troops to Libya to support Sarraj's government of national accord. French President Emmanuel Macron, for his part, is firmly against Turkey's role in Libya. On the day of the Berlin conference, Agence France-Presse reported that Macron voiced his acute concerns over the reported involvement of Turkish-backed Syrian fighters in the Libyan civil war. That must end, Macron was quoted as saying. Turkey has been accused of sending hundreds of Syrian militants into Tripoli to back up Sarraj's government, while Russia has allegedly deployed mercenaries to lend support to Haftar. On January 20, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that Turkey had not yet deployed Turkish troops to Libya, only military advisors and trainers. We are not sending military forces to Libya at the moment. We have only sent a group for training and they carried it out there, Erdogan told reporters on his way back from Berlin, while also slamming the presence of mercenaries in support of Haftar. Wagner is there with 2,500 security personnel. Why don't we discuss it? He also said.
This evening I have Kenan Sharpe in the studio with me. Mr. Sharpe is a freelance journalist and an academic based between Santa Cruz, California and Istanbul, Turkey. He has a PhD in literature from the University of California. He's an editor and co-founder of Blindfield, a journal of cultural inquiry. He also is a columnist for Duvar English and is an assistant editor for Common Magazine. Good evening, Mr. Sharpe. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me, Shida.
Okay, so this evening we're going to be talking about the literary legacy of political prisoners in Turkey. So we're going to start with Selahattin Demirtas. So Selahattin Demirtas has been imprisoned 3 years ago, presumably by putting him in prison, there was no doubt a need to want to silence him and keep him out of the limelight. Yet Demirtas is constantly on our agenda, and we're talking about him quite a lot, not only because of his social media presence, but also due to his literary output. Do you think that this aspect of his identity has centralized him more into a figure that appeals to larger masses? I mean, we've seen the first signs of these in June 2015, but do you think his literary persona furthered this image?
Absolutely. I think for Demirtas, literature is a way of doing politics by other means. Literature makes him not just an imprisoned politician anymore, but someone who can enter our lives via his books. He's stuck in a cell, but I think he's even more of a household name, as you suggest, both in Turkey and also abroad, importantly. I think writing preserves interest in his case, and it also pushes what we know about him in a new direction. Like Rushan Chakır said in a broadcast in Medyascope about him recently, Demirtas has really remained an active figure in our cultural life, and I think it's really through his literature, which has become sort of a lifeline for him, keeping him relevant. It also allows him to control the narrative. I mean, sadly, there are many urgent situations of injustice here in Turkey and in the world, and sadly our attention spans are short. And language can be used to decry these wrongs and injustices, but just talking about it in that manner can make it sort of shrill. The German poet Bertolt Brecht said once in a poem that, quote, "Rage, even against injustice, makes the voice hoarse. We who wish to lay the foundations for kindness could not ourselves be kind." And I think in a way, Demirtas rejects this philosophy. I think the way he sees it more is that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. And he uses literature, humor, moments of silliness, and also piercing sadness. And by doing that, I think he keeps us engaged and preserves interest in him and also keeps us from seeing him just as a unwilling victim. And I think the appeal for the masses, as you said, is really there. I mean, Demirtas' second book of short stories, Devran, sold more than 150,000 copies just in the first 2 weeks. In 2019, it was reprinted 4 times. And people line up for book signings, and he's not even there in person. So I think it shows a massive interest. So in short, literature has been hugely important for Demirtas. And I imagine it's also been good for his own mental health while in prison. His body's captive, but his imagination is able to reach out both to the wider world and into his own past and memories as well.
Well, you mentioned Devran, and actually Devran was adapted to a one-off theater play to which a lot of high-profile figures attended, artists, politicians, and so forth. And these people were later targeted by the government because as supporting terrorism and Demirtas having blood on his hands. These types of public denunciations and smear campaigns are not uncommon to Turkey. What do you think that the ruling Justice and Development Party is afraid of when it comes to Demirtas?
I think there's a lot. I think the fact that we had this one-off play who gave rise to no small amount of controversy shows something. Whatever certain people are afraid of, targeting this pretty small performance is actually giving free press to Demirtas and to his literary career and his new book that just came out a couple days ago. But like you said, some important people did attend the show, and this says something. From the main opposition Republican People's Party, there was people as well as from Demirtas' own HDP. Besides Canan Kaftancıoğlu and the legendary actor Kadir İnanır, there was also Başak Demirtas, Demirtas' wife, Dilek İmamoğlu, the wife of Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, and also Selvi Kılıçdaroğlu, the wife of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Some pretty high-profile people. And I think the goal of imprisoning Demirtas, and maybe the fear, was based in a desire to make him untouchable, to smear him with the T word, terrorism. But all these people coming to the performances shows that this strategy hasn't really been very effective. He's not isolated, and I think, in fact, this makes certain circles more angry and frustrated. I mean, we're talking about a person, Demirtas, whose imprisonment was found to be illegal by a ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, yet who remains in prison. And I think Dilek İmamoğlu and Selvi Kılıçdaroğlu's attendance in particular shows a certain amount of solidarity with Demirtas without getting overly involved, perhaps. Ekrem İmamoğlu issued a quite interesting statement refusing to apologize for his wife's attendance, saying that she's an educated, intelligent woman who can go to whatever play or performance she would like. And he didn't come right out and say anything about Demirtas or in support of him per se. But I think Dilek İmamoğlu's presence there perhaps sends a message of ongoing warmth and support between these two parties. Of course, it was also through an electoral alliance and from the HDP supporting the People's Republican Party and their candidate İmamoğlu in the local elections that allowed İmamoğlu to prevail in the end. Mm-hmm. As informal as attending a play might be, I think it does show a certain amount of ongoing collaboration, perhaps for the future. I was also reading an interview with Emir Ali Türkmen. He's the head of Dipnote Publishing, who published Demirtas' latest book, and he had this to say. He said, quote, "Demirtas is making literature, putting words together, and they're scared because they're incapable of doing this. The text written by this person they call marginal has been read by thousands of people." And indeed, Demirtas' first book sold over 200,000 copies, and it's gotten a really great reception abroad. It won the PEN Translator Award in England. Demirtas was made an honorary member of PEN in Germany, Mexico, Catalonia. And the book was translated into numerous languages. The English edition in particular is interesting. It was published under an imprint of the famous actress Sarah Jessica Parker under Penguin Random House. And there was a great moment where she left her New York apartment holding the book under her arm, which is interesting. And the two other books that have now come out by Demirtas are certain to be translated as well. So I think whatever the fear is, the more Demirtas writes, the harder it is actually to isolate him, both domestically and internationally.
Mm-hmm. So actually in the preface of his book, Dawn, Demirtas talks about literature and politics as both venues of contention. And he says, he states in the preface of the book that expected to create meaning and to observe their societies closely and reflect upon the issues that the society faces. In this context of the quote, how do you evaluate Demirtas as a politician versus Demirtas as a writer? Does his writing reflect his political identity?
I think it does in many ways, and I think that quote gives us a clue. Mm-hmm. We could say in a way that both literature and politics require close powers of observation. If they're done right, being a good writer doesn't necessarily mean that one's political opinions are correct. Conversely, even sort of political reactionary writers can produce insightful works if they're honest as writers. I'm going to give a little example. Karl Marx's favorite novelist was the French writer Balzac, who was a diehard monarchist. But Balzac's close observations and the way he was able to decipher the society in which he lived gave his work incredible diagnostic power. So this is all to say the relationship of politics and literature, it's complex, it's never one-to-one, but they're close. On the other side, there's the issue of language and politics. I think we can think of language as often degrading language or turning words into their opposite. Mm-hmm. There's this famous example of an American general during the Vietnam War who said it became necessary to destroy the town to save it. This is a real example of sort of degrading language. Or a more contemporary example is politicians announcing that the economy is doing well and inflation is down, where you could stop any person in the street and they would tell you that's not the case. So there can be dishonest, deceptive literature, but to be a good politician and a good writer at the same time is difficult, and it pushes one to grapple with the power of words. So let me leave this literary digression aside. It's a bit of a occupational deformation, as we say, but this is what I see Demirtas doing. He's long been a kind of unique kind of politician. He's young, he's charismatic, he plays the saws, he sings, and his rhetorical style is really something interesting too. He can be harsh and biting, but he's compelling. He's sometimes funny. He quotes from literature and music. In some ways, he's a bit like Turkey's old Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit, I think, in certain respects, who, of course, ran a modernist art gallery in Ankara. In the 50s, he published poetry. And I think this kind of Renaissance figure who is cultured, educated, artistic, and most importantly, approachable. This is something we haven't seen for quite a while, neither in Turkey or in the world, sadly. So I think Demirtas's literary personality increases his approachableness as a politician. And though his works aren't autobiographical, we kind of get a sense of who he is as a person through these works. His way of thinking, his childhood, his interests, his favorite foods even. In the latest book, there was a really wonderful description of a garlicky late-night meal of lamb's foot soup, pacha, that really made my mouth water while reading. This is not the kind of thing you get from a politician often, but this is what I'm saying. It gives us another insight into him. And in the new book, Leylan, we also get a sense of how his political philosophy and his literary philosophy intersect. I'm going to read a very short passage I translated from the new book. But like I said, it just came out 2 days ago, so bear with me. One of Demirtas's characters says in the book, "If in your heart of hearts you think you're a good person and you want people to be happy, this isn't enough to make you a good person in the full sense of the word. It just makes you harmless. But if you have the opportunity to do something for people's happiness and don't, this makes you a bad person. If you ask me, the foundational criteria for being a good person is not holding the key to other people's happiness hostage in your hands. Either you don't promise anyone happiness or you don't hold that key hostage." So here Demirtas doesn't say it outright, but the suggestion, voiced through one of his characters, is that what it would make to make a society happy is at least not to actively prevent the condition for their flourishing, for their happiness. And this is really a question about life, it's a question about politics, and it's a question about aesthetics. So I think his literary works, to answer your question about his identity as a politician, ask us about our responsibility to each other. Like he wrote in the preface to the first book, Dawn, again I'm quoting, "What lies at the heart of my relationship with politics is not lofty ideals or abstractions, but ordinary people who are capable of changing the world." So I think this ordinariness, this concreteness, these details are at the heart of both who he is as a politician and a writer.
Yeah. Well, you just mentioned quite a few details about the content of and the themes of his books, but have you seen a shift in tone or a different type of exploration when you look at all three books in general? And I mean, you also said that the Seher, Dawn, was translated into several different languages, and probably the other two will be as well. What do you think appeals to audiences outside of Turkey in these stories?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, each book is showing us something slightly different. And of course, the first two books were short story books, and the new one is a novel. But the first one, what's interesting about it, it has a sort of feminist bent. I mean, the word Seher both means something like dawn, is also a woman's name. And the book really focuses on issues affecting women in Turkey and in the world. The title story is about a woman named Seher who works in a textile factory. She decides to go out with a boy from the factory, and the story takes a real dark turn where that man kidnaps and rapes her, and then she goes home to her family, survives, and is killed by her father. So it takes up really serious issues of honor killings, and other of the stories too. When you summarize the plots, it sounds like they're just sort of hitting major issues that are affecting Turkey today, which is important. But I think what makes it come alive as literature in that first book is really, again, the details. For example, there's a great story, I think it's the first one in Dawn. It's about a man in a maximum security prison. And you get a sense of the kind of tedium of everyday life for a prisoner like this. And perhaps the most exciting thing that happens to this prisoner all year is that two sparrows nest outside of his window and start building a nest. And the prisoner begins talking with the sparrows. The sparrows are able to speak back in language. But then inspectors from a thing called the Department of Nesting Code Enforcement come and they dismantle the nest. The mother sparrow tries to fight back to protect her chicks. So in this little story, we have a depiction of the boringness or the tedium of prison life. We have a kind of parable about the absurd rules and regulations of bureaucracy, the petty restrictions, and all these things. So it's political, but it's told in a way that's memorable and sticks with you. If I can give one more example of a fantastic story from there, I think my favorite one is called Nazan the Cleaning Lady. We have a woman who lives in the slums of Ankara, and she takes the bus to work to go clean rich people's houses. But we're privy to Nazan's thought as she's riding in the bus and looking out the window. And the thing about Nazan is that she's obsessed with cars. Her father was a master mechanic, and she devours these sort of car magazines about different makes and models and everything that's happening. And she's a real philosopher of humanity, but through cars. So she's looking out the window, she notices from what people drive and how they drive and what kind of people they are, what they're thinking, etc. It's a really charming story, and then things start to get complicated when she gets off the bus in Kızılay in Ankara, and there's a protest happening, and she happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and gets arrested, and no one is able to believe her story, and she's stuck in prison. So these are the kind of stories we have here where they're political, but the details make them humane and convincing, like with Nazan's love of cars. She's not just an allegory, she's a person, you feel, reading these things. But at other times, the writing goes flat. Sometimes words show up like gentrification or living standards, and in some ways, Demirtaş the politician kind of casts a shadow over Demirtaş the writer. But I think this is getting worked out as he continues to write. So in Devran, his second book, it's also a book of short stories. And for me, the most memorable one is, again, the first one, about a man named Salim. He's a state prosecutor. And he's had a successful career. He's middle-aged now. He lives with his wife and children in Istanbul. But one day, his son gets in a car accident, and it's nearly fatal. He goes to the hospital, and his son's all wrapped up in bandages. And he sees his eyes, and something clicks in Salim's head. And as soon as his son gets better, he tells his family, I need to go to Erzurum. It's the middle of winter. They think he's crazy. But he gets on a plane and goes, and he walks the streets, and 25 years ago, as a young prosecutor, he was living there in Erzurum. He sees the coffee shop he used to sit at, he sees the courthouse he used to work at, etc. And he rents a Jeep, and against everyone's protestations, he decides to drive through the heavy, heavy snow to a remote village. He makes it to the village. He can't even drive up all the way because the snow is so thick and heavy. And some people come out to greet him. They speak in Kurdish. He tries to explain what he's trying to do. The muhtar, the village head, welcomes him into his house, but he wants to stay with an old villager named Hassan. This Hassan doesn't seem to know who he is, but he welcomes him to his house. He and his wife lay out a nice table of food, they offer him tobacco, they sit at the fire, etc. And Salim wants to say something, but he can't quite bring himself to say it, but he sees a picture on the mantle of a young man, also with piercing eyes. And he thinks, they must not remember me, but there's something haunting about this photograph of the young boy. The next morning, he realizes he's not going to say what he came there in such a panic to say. But as he's leaving, the man Hassan hands him an envelope and says, you'll find everything here. So he gets back in the Jeep. He pulls off on the side of the road. It's all snowy still. And he looks through the documents and he realizes that this man, the villager, knew very well who he was. What happened is 25 years earlier, this villager's son was a shepherd, and he got wounded in some crossfire one day, and the gendarme came and picked him up and thought he was some sort of terrorist. And he ends up being killed by being tortured. And for 25 years, this villager and his wife have been trying to seek justice for their son because they covered it up and said he came with wounds and died from them. So it's a really powerful moment when you realize what happened. But the amazing thing is that despite these two villagers knowing who this man was in their house, they didn't say a single thing. They said one doesn't ask a guest why they come. But for years they've been trying to seek justice. They filed lawsuits against the prosecutor himself, against the gendarme on duty, against the doctors, etc. So again, political stories, but through really piercing details, they show a sort of whole social complex.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this tradition of writing literature from prison is unfortunately not new to Turkey, but is apparently in the last 2 years since the crackdown, since the coup d'etat of 2016, it has been reported that at least 8 books have come out from prison, from people who've been, who are currently or formerly who have been in prison in the last 2 years. Could it be perhaps argued that writing is a form of rebellion in and of itself, or how would you frame this literary legacy in Turkey?
It's really complex in Turkey, definitely, and it's true that in the last few years we have seen a boom, sadly, in prison writing. And there's been several books. I mean, Ahmet Altan put out a book, or is about to put out a book called I Will Never See the World Again, a haunting title. Kadri Gürsel wrote a memoir of his life as a journalist while in prison as well. And the arrest of these prominent voices has led to the revival of an old joke, a sort of very dark form of humor. And the joke goes, it's about a prison library. You probably heard it before. Someone asks for a certain book and they're told, no, the book's not here, but we have the writer. We laugh, but it's really dark humor for dark times. And like you said, this is nothing new. In the mid-20th century, Nazım Hikmet, the great poet, spent more than 13 years in prison. There was an massive international campaign to try to free him that involved Pablo Picasso, Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, Paul Robeson, and many more. And for Nazım Hikmet and others, I think the experience of prison really strongly shaped their work and the form and content of it. For Nazım Hikmet, again, he met with the poor villagers and workers who he was trying to reach and also write about in his works, really for the first time, and wrote to them. And in Turkey and in other places, prison really became like a school for writers. In that same period, Kemal Tahir and Orhan Kemal and Nazım Hikmet would all write to each other and sort of workshop each other's works as if it was a sort of creative writing seminar. And there was also the example of Ahmet Arif, who wrote his famous book, I Wore Out These Fetters Through Longing while in prison. And then he couldn't publish it for almost 20 years. It took till 1968 till he was able to finally publish it. And then if we move from poetry to the novel, there's a whole genre of a Turkish novel called the 12 March novel, referring to the coup of 1971, 12 March 1971, the military memorandum, more correctly. So the writer Sevgi Soysal wrote Şafak about this period and other novels. Melih Cevdet Anday did the same. And also I must add that there's been conservative and Islamist figures who've written from jail, such as Necip Fazıl. And the irony, of course, is that Turkish President Erdogan himself was in prison for a short time for reading a poem. So literature, sadly, Turkish literature continues to have this aspect.
Side to it, yeah. So as you mentioned, Leylan came out this week, Demirtaş's third book and first novel, but there has been some backlash against it, where some publishers and bookstores don't want to necessarily sell it or have it visible on in their shops, even though there has also been a lot of solidarity with Demirtaş's work. How do you see these obstacles in the face of freedom of expression?
It's a major issue, absolutely. And many of the writers I mentioned before were actually only in prison for things they wrote. Similar things have happened with directors or filmmakers and continues to happen. It's been interesting. After the Interior Minister's comments about the new book, I read an interview with Kenan Sharpe, who's the head of the Publishers Union in Turkey. And he said something interesting. He said, are we going back to the coup days of 1980? He says, now Demirtaş's new book is coming out. This is the person who received millions of votes. Whose place is it to say whether or not he's allowed to write books? So the 1980 coup and the other military coups in Turkey were really dark times. And if you ask around, many families have anecdotes about burying books, about burning books. There's stories about the smoke from all the chimneys of people burning banned books they were scared would land them in jail, about seeing the smoke from this. And similar things happened all over the world in the 20th century in periods of dictatorship, from Argentina to Greece and beyond. But in some ways, we're still in this period here in Turkey. But I think today, even if books are banned, it's harder than ever to control with forms of digital publishing and torrenting. And even in earlier periods, like when Nazım Hikmet's works were banned from 1938 to 1965, people wrote out their own copies, they memorized the poems to keep them alive. And I hope we won't have to go back to this sort of clandestine style of publishing, but I think people will find a way no matter what. And I think the enormous solidarity by so many publishers and also interesting comments by Ekrem İmamoğlu about this topic show that people are pushing back strongly. So I think even if people try to block the sale of Demirtaş's books on certain platforms, like they've been campaigning for, he remains pretty unperturbed by the whole thing, which is interesting. It's his style, again, literary and political. He tweeted recently saying, quote, "The knives you throw at us can no longer wound us." So I think in this way, Demirtaş is a lot like his own characters. He refuses to grow bitter and hoarse at injustice and is able to still sort of make fun of it or push it in a different channel. He doesn't let rage become a corrosive thing. And I think he's still, like many of us, preserving his optimism as best he can and trying to keep hope alive until somehow the tables turn.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sharpe, for joining us and for providing these comments both on the literary legacy, let's say, of writing from prison and your comments on Demirtaş's own work.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
The U.S. government said on Tuesday that Turkey's state-owned Halkbank should be subjected to escalating fines totaling millions of dollars until it responds in court to criminal charges over helping Iran evade U.S. economic sanctions.
U.S. Attorney Geoffrey Berman on Tuesday asked a judge to impose a $1 million per day fine on the bank for the contempt of court. A penalty, he said, should double for each week of non-compliance. That would bring the total fine on Halkbank to $105 million after 1 month of further non-compliance and $1.8 billion after 2 months. Mr. Berman described the bank's behavior as part of a long course of conduct by both the defendant itself and the defendant's principal shareholder, the government of Turkey, aimed at obstructing the investigation. He said the snowballing system of fines was an appropriate and necessary sanction in order to force the bank to appear in court. A US-based lawyer for Halkbank did not immediately respond to requests for comment. Halkbank, which denies the charges, argues that the US justice system has no jurisdiction over its operations. US prosecutors announced fraud and money laundering charges in the case on October 15, saying Halkbank and its executives use money servicers and front companies in Iran, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates to evade sanctions. Prosecutors also said Halkbank undertook transactions on Iran's behalf that would have exposed the bank to sanctions, including allowing revenue from oil and gas sales to be spent on gold and facilitating sham purchases of food and medicine. 9 people have been criminally charged. They included former Halkbank executive Mehmet Hakan Atilla, who was convicted in January 2018 after another defendant, wealthy Turkish-Iranian gold trader Reza Zarrab, pleaded guilty and testified against him. Atilla returned to Turkey last year after leaving prison and became the general manager of the Istanbul Stock Exchange. The next hearing of Halkbank will be held on February 25.
Veteran politician and writer Rahşan Ecevit died at the age of 97 in the capital Ankara on January 17.
Ecevit, who was also the wife of late Turkish Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit, and the founder of the Democratic Left Party, died at the Gülhane Training and Research Hospital, where she had been receiving treatment since December 26. She died at the intensive care unit of the hospital due to multiple organ failure. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the head of Turkey's main opposition Republican People's Party, released a statement on his Twitter account following Ecevit's death. I am in sorrow for the loss of Rahşan Ecevit, my chairman Bülent Ecevit's partner and an important name of our political history. Her life of faithfulness, loyalty and struggle will be an example for the future generations. I wish God's mercy on Ecevit and extend my condolences to her beloved ones, Kılıçdaroğlu said.
Editor-in-chief of Agos newspaper Hrant Dink, who was murdered in an armed attack in front of Agos newspaper in the Şişli district of Istanbul 13 years ago, has been commemorated on Sunday, January 19th.
This year, the speeches at the commemoration were held by human rights activist Professor Şebnem Korur Financı on behalf of Hrant's friends and Sertaç Ekinci from Collective Memory Platform, whose father, Yusuf Ekinci, was killed in 1994. Apart from Justice for Hrant, this year, Hrant's friends were also using the slogan, "It is not late to be ashamed." Accordingly, a banner that read, "It is not late to be ashamed," was hung on Sebat apartment, where the former office of Agos newspaper was located. Making a brief statement before the commemoration, Hrant Dink's friend Bülent Aydın also commemorated Tahir Elçi, the chair of Diyarbakır Bar Association, murdered in Sur, Diyarbakır in 2015, and Cüneyt Cebenoyan, who lost his life in a car accident last summer. He also sent his greetings to imprisoned former co-chair of Democratic People's Party, Selahattin Demirtaş, and arrested businessperson and rights defender Osman Kavala. After the speeches, carnations were laid on the sidewalk where Hrant Dink was shot to death and fell. Due to the symbolic significance of the site and its place in the collective memory, the Hrant Dink Foundation, founded after his assassination, turned the building into the 23.5 Hrant Dink Site of Memory. A plaque that reads, "Hrant Dink was murdered here, January 19, 2007 at 3:05 was embedded in the sidewalk in front of the building where Dink was killed, serving as a stark reminder for visitors and passerbys. An important figure within the Armenian community in Turkey, Dink had sought to commence public discussion and was an advocate of democratization and human rights. He was repeatedly prosecuted for denigrating Turkishness over articles he wrote about Armenian identity and the Armenian genocide in 1915. O gün Samast, Dink's killer, was captured and sentenced to 23 years in prison for the murder. Agos continues to circulate in Turkey in Turkish and Armenian, albeit from a different location to which it moved in 2015.
The Istanbul Political Research Institute has conducted a research about the precarity of youth and has released the results of the report to the public.
The results of the research entitled Precocity of Youth, the Perception of Work, Subsistence and Life has been shared with the public in a meeting organized on Saturday, January 18th. The research was conducted in the form of focus groups with 25 individuals between the ages of 18 and 30. The first focus group comprised of individuals who were either still university students or who had a university degree and were employed. The second focus group included individuals who did not have a higher education degree but who were employed, and the last focus group were individuals who were not employed in any way. The research aimed to measure the experiences and perceptions relating to work, livelihood, and living conditions of the participant youths. In this regard, questions were directed to the participants regarding their work and workplaces, their livelihood conditions and expectations, and their emotions vis-à-vis their experiences. According to the report, young people want to have a regular job where they are paid regularly and have consistent working hours. The results relating to livelihood underline the difficulty in maintaining a certain standard of living. Most of the participants receive financial support from their families. Furthermore, the results show that most participants feel under stress and are worried about their futures due to the developments in the country and the world. The results among the unemployed specifically demonstrate that they feel inadequate. In the last section of the report, the participants blamed politicians for their precarious situations. Following politicians, Syrian refugees and the population itself were also blamed. The participants also stated that if they had the chance, they would leave Turkey.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. See you next Friday at 9 p.m. Good night.
İnsanlar niçin hapis yatar, niçin acı çeker?
Gazeteci Uğur Mumcu'nun hayatını kaybetti.
Evet, Mumcu bu sabah 9.45 sıralarında gazeteye son kez uğradı.
Atatürk'e, demokrasiye ve laikliğe inanan bu insanlar tek yürek, tek ses halinde Uğur Mumcu'nun ardında yürüyorlar.
Onun bedenini yok edenler bunu yok ettiklerini sandı ama yanıldılar.